I just love to travel. Getting away to a new place, being by myself or travelling with friends. I guess it feeds something in me. It makes me feel more alive. This is the way that nearly all of my novels have begun, with a journey. Either to somewhere that I know well already or somewhere new. Talking about Congo Dawn, we need to go back to the very beginning for me, to Africa. I was born in Tanzania, back when it was Tanganyika, before independence. My father was a missionary doctor and my mother an artist. Dad, in fact, was a safari doctor, and that meant that he did most of his work way out in the bush, and I had 3 brothers and sisters. The 4 of us would go with the rest of the family on these long safaris out to the bush. Dad would set up tents and run a clinic out of the back of his Land Rover. And he was dealing with all of the medical problems that the people had: leprosy, malnutrition, malaria. There was no other access to Western medicine for those people. So he was very busy, working very hard, doing that under one tree. Under another tree, my mother would be set up with her easel, painting portraits of local people who'd come and pose for her, or the landscape. And us kids were really allowed to just wander around, do whatever we like. We just had to avoid hopefully getting eaten by crocodiles or treading on snakes or any of the other many dangerous things of the African bush we had to try and avoid falling prey to. So we hunted for any meat that we ate, we shot, or my father shot, and we knew that you never wasted meat, you ate and that was your food. They were never under any illusions about where food came from, and we were never under any illusions about the fact that life and death went hand in hand and that this was all a part of the way things were. So it was an unusual childhood from that point of view, remembered by me and my other brothers and sisters as a wonderful era of our lives. And then when I was 10, it all came to an end, and we had to leave Africa so that my older sister would not have to go away to boarding school. And so the whole family moved to England, which is where my parents had come from. And suddenly there we were in a cold country with small gardens, and as a probably imaginative child that I was, I passionately mourned the loss of my homeland. I grieved really as a young child for Africa, and I was just very fortunate though, because my school teacher there was experimenting with what was at the time a brand new subject called creative writing, and he saw in me this emotion that needed to be brought out, and he gave me writing as my avenue of expression. I wrote free verse, and I've still got that book, my school book, and I consider it my first book as an author, because in that I poured out my feelings about everything. I think that was when I became a writer. That was when I started using writing as a way of understanding the world and communicating, and I've been writing ever since. So I wrote lots of different kinds of books. In a way, I was dealing with the emotions that came from that time, that loss of that homeland at that particular age. But my last half dozen novels have been set in Africa, as is my new one, Congo Dawn. Congo Dawn began with a journey, like most of my other African novels. This time it was to Lake Tanganyika, which is on the inland border of Tanzania, one of the most extraordinary places that I've ever been, standing on the shores of that lake. I was there with my parents. They've been on each of my trips back to Tanzania to work on novels. They speak such fluent Swahili, and of course, being older, they're very respected by the local people wherever we go, and it just gives me all the access I need to understand everything that's going on. My idea was to go to Jane Goodall's chimpanzee research station at Gombe Stream, which is on the shores of Lake Tanganyika. Like many people, I grew up looking at the National Geographic magazine with stories about her looking very glamorous in her safari gear with the chimpanzees in the jungle, and it was a very romantic image for me, and I thought it was time to go there and see for myself the world that she had. It still is, in fact, her primary home is there in the national park, tiny little national park there on the lake. So we set off, but you catch a boat along the lake shore and land and go into the jungle. And fascinating as it was to look at the chimpanzees and to fight our way through the forest, especially with my ageing parents in company with us, I was still attracted by the fact that when you looked across Lake Tanganyika, on the other side of the lake, you can see the Congo. Distant hills, sometimes misty, depending on the time of day. And I just found that my attention kept being drawn back to that other country, because like many people, I had a lot of ideas of the word Congo conjured in my mind. I knew that it had been one of the worst colonial regimes of the world. It had been a Belgian colony. It had set the bar really for colonial exploitation anywhere. I was well aware, of course, of the present day problems that the Congo, now the DRC, experiences. So that kept making me think that perhaps there was a different story that was going to be told this time, not about chimpanzees, but about other things. I felt there was a gap actually in my writing, because I've written a lot about the romance of the colonial era. The Hunter's Wife in particular was one set on a safari lodge back in the 60s, where we love that sense of the history of Ernest Hemingway and Out of Africa and Karen Blixen's writings. It's founded on a colonial era that is a very difficult period of history to come to terms with. So I started to think maybe for this new book the time had come to seriously look hard in the face of this history. Of course, like all my novels, it would be the emotional story of some characters that we can all identify with, that would feel recognisable to us from our everyday lives. And for me, that's a given. That's what I always write about. And I find that it's when people can recognise the themes and connect with it in their own lives that they feel most connected with what you've written. So in Congo Dawn, this is very much the case again. But the setting is against the colonial heritage of the Congo. So I needed to research the whole history of the Congo, starting with the colonial era, going right back to King Leopold, who was the most vicious ruler. The stories of the mutilation of village people in the Congo actually gave me nightmares. They think that there may have been more Congolese killed during King Leopold's regime than were lost in the Holocaust in the Nazi era. So it was a horrendous genocide that went on then. And that was the backdrop that my story was set in. Because it was in living memory of my characters of the 60s, there still would have been people without hands who'd lost their hands as children at the hands of the Belgian police force, the Force Publique. When a lot of people think about the Congo, they think of the novel Heart of Darkness. a lot of people haven't read it, and even though they haven't, they know that it's a story about exploitation and cruelty by colonial powers in the Congo. It was in fact an activist novel written by Conrad. It was an attempt to bring public attention to the atrocities that were being carried out there, and along with a number of other voices spread around the world, it had the effect of bringing Leopold's regime to an end. And then it was operated as a colony by the country of Belgium. Things improved, but not enough. Independence finally came to the country in 1960, and the people had high hopes at last of being able to use the wealth of the country for their own good. But it was not to be, and their first Prime Minister, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated shortly after he came into power. He was a socialist. He had thought that socialism was appropriate for Africa to share as a sharing economy for the country. As I started to look into the events that surrounded the death of Lumumba, his assassination, in which the CIA and the Belgians and a number of other outside powers have been implicated, I began to see that this was a really awful story of broken dreams and injustice, and it wasn't surprising that a rebellion such as the Simbas would begin as in an attempt to take the country back from the puppet government or the pro-Western government that was put in place after Lumumba was killed. The interesting thing about the Simba rebels was that although they would go on to massacre missionary children and become such a source of fear to many, they started out with the very highest ideals. And in Congo Dawn you'll discover a version is included of the Simba rebel code of conduct, and people following those rules, they would have been the best behaved soldiers in the world. So I was interested in rebel movements actually already. Back in the late 80s, I was working as a documentary filmmaker with my husband, who's a filmmaker. We were in Ethiopia making a film for the ABC about the Eritrean Ethiopian War, civil war. And Thomas Keneally, of course, wrote his wonderful book Towards Asmara about that conflict, and that book made a great impression on me at the time when I came back and read it. So that whole story of how a rebel movement begins with high ideals and the problems that often emerge later was something that I'd already been very interested in. So that too came up in my mind as something that would be on my plate with the book that became Congo Dawn. Because the Cold War was being played out in the Congo, it became a focus of interest for people from all over the world. And it's a very little known fact that the famous revolutionary Che Guevara went to the Congo. He took a band of Cuban soldiers to help the Simba rebels to bring their rebellion back on track when it had started to go off the rails. Che Guevara, it didn't work. He retired in despair after only a number of defeats, and he could see, in fact, that it wasn't as easy to transfer revolutionary ideas from one country to another as he had imagined. So he spent time, Che Guevara spent time in Kigoma on the shores of Lake Tanganyika, which is where we went to as a setting off point for our journey to Gombe Stream. And I saw a young Tanzanian man with a T-shirt with Che Guevara, with the famous portrait of Che Guevara screen printed on the front. And I said to him, "Did you know that Che Guevara came here to your town?" And he looked very surprised. But that was an interesting little piece of history. Of course, Australia has its own connection with this story through Vietnam. Vietnam was brewing as a Cold War stage at the same time that these issues were going on in the Congo. It was said that the future of the free world was at stake in the Congo, and that if the Simbas weren't put down, somehow the West would unravel. It was the same story that was told about Vietnam, that the domino effect would occur, so it was vital that these communists be stopped in their tracks. Thinking about the Congo took me straight back to a book that had always been on our family bookshelf as far back as I could remember, and it had kind of haunted me as a child. It's this book, Missing, Believed, Killed, by Margaret Hayes, who was a missionary nurse. She was captured during the Simba Rebellion of 1964 by the rebels and held in the jungle with them for many, many weeks, living in fear and suffering some terrible experiences. The thing about this book that attracted my attention as a child was this photograph inside here. It's a family photograph, and the caption reads, Hazel and Stephen in the centre were in England at the time of the uprising and so escaped massacre. And so this was the story of a whole mission station full of people who were killed by the Simba rebel soldiers, and this tragic family where 3 children were killed along with their parents and just the only 2 survived. And as a child, a missionary child myself, living in Africa, I used to just look at this and think, what on earth could have happened? How could things have reached the point that someone wanted to kill these children? And so, having decided that the Congo would be the setting for my next book, of course this was the book that I was going to go to next and read. And that began my journey towards reading the whole history of the Simba Rebellion and all the things that unfolded. The author of this book, Margaret Hayes, survived. Nearly everyone else she worked with was killed, but she was rescued by mercenary soldiers. So I knew I needed to research the role that they played. They were brought in by the Congolese government to fight the Simba rebels. They were, as it turns out, backed by a number of foreign powers, including the CIA and the Belgian military, and that all becomes a part of the story that I was going to tell. But I knew that I needed to have at least an appearance of these mercenary soldiers. I didn't think they'd be important characters in my book. I thought they would probably rescue some people for me and then disappear. But to find out what kind of people they were, I started reading memoirs of these soldiers. Mike Hoare was the person who put together these mercenary units. He's written several memoirs that I've read, and then I went on to read about many other soldiers and the experiences that they had. And to my astonishment, I became very fascinated by these men. What a mixed bunch they were. Adventurers, cowboys, drug addicts, misfits, brave people, men, a lot of them who had just discovered that fighting was the only thing that they really did well. Men who'd fought in other battles and found that they could no longer live without that intense mateship that arises during hand-to-hand combat, and where your friends' lives are held in your hands day after day. I mean, it's something that most of us will never probably experience. So I looked further and further into who these men were and decided in the end that they were going to be important people in Congo Dawn. And in fact, half of Congo Dawn is written from the point of view of Dan Miller, a character who is one of these mercenary soldiers. So that was quite a challenge for me to be writing about this kind of content. And I had to put together my mercenary commando, and I needed about 30 of them. And I used a process I've used often before, which is I cast real actors or real people, faces, in the roles of all these people. So I think I had a big notice board with about 20 men, 20 faces on it, ranging from some of my favourite people like Sean Penn, who through to, I've got Prince Harry, real soldiers, actors playing soldiers, and just, I think there's a surfer there, Mick Fanning, you might recognise his face on my board. And I had to assign ranks to them, and so that I had the correct combination of skills in my unit. And then case histories to each one. Why was this particular man there in the Congo at this time? And I just became very interested in them, and it started to bring up that ambivalence that a lot of us have about violence and the military and soldiers, because it's not natural probably for a woman like me to be very interested in soldiers or even very supportive of what they do. But I can tell you, when I saw pictures of those mercenary soldiers rescuing missionary children in the Congo and, carrying them, in some cases, one case I read, holding a child under one arm and firing with a machine gun with the other, and just running through hails of bullets rescuing these children, you started to see these soldiers in a different way, and you started to realise that if it was your family in such terrible danger, you'd be very glad to see these people, even while in some ways they might have been the most unruly, disrespectful, disreputable bunch of people that you'd ever like to meet. So some of this sort of conundrum about life, really, I guess, started to arise out of these characters. So I loved this era that I found myself writing in the 1960s. Was the independence era in Africa. It was Beatle time in England, Beatlemania sweeping the world, Mary Quant designing short dresses. It was just a really interesting period of time to set a novel. And I've got a lovely character in the book, Eliza, who's an American heiress. Her father's made his fortune from the exploitation of the Congo. She's an interesting character because she's not at all who she appears to be when we first meet her. But she's very glamorous and very much a part of that 1960s world. And at the heart of this story is my character Anna, who's a secretary from Melbourne. She's a bit like us. She doesn't know anything about the Congo. She's not that brave, but a search really for a reconnection with her estranged father has driven her to seize the opportunity to travel to the Congo and try and build a relationship with him. So we're experiencing all of the strangeness and the conflicts and difficulties of the world of the Congo, and the glamour and the exoticism of the Congo through her eyes. And at that level, the story really is a journey into the deepest heart, not only of colonial African history, but of the history of one family, and the fractures that have occurred, and the lies that have been told, and the damage that has spread out between different characters. So that, in a way, is the through line of the book, is the personal story alongside the big picture story of the Congo. As with all novels, you've got to have a broad palette, and you get a chance to bring lots of other interests into that story. And the art of the Congo was always of great appeal to me ever since first seeing Congolese masks in a French museum when I was in my early 20s. And so we see that the Congolese power figures, the Nkisi, play a very important role in my story. And Picasso's work also make an appearance. Picasso said that when he first saw the Congolese masks, when he saw them in France, they changed the way he saw the world. And of course, with my mother's interest in art, I grew up with Picasso being talked about, and our house at the same time had all the African carvings and African masks that we had collected. So this was another intersection between my own life and what I was looking at with Congo Dawn. And particularly too that ambivalence that a lot of the missionary families definitely felt about African tribal art. They didn't understand traditional African beliefs very well, if at all, in nearly every case, and felt very concerned that perhaps there was some power contained in these artefacts that meant that they shouldn't have anything to do with them. I've always had in pride of place on my desk a little sculpture that probably was carved by an African witch doctor or for spiritual purposes, and it turns out to be, because the reason I say that is it's got a crow sitting on the man's head, and crow's a symbol of witchcraft, so I've always wondered exactly what that little carving was about, but anyway, it watches me write. interesting locations pop up when you want them in the story. So one of the things from Jane Goodall's research station that did find its way into Congo Dawn was the extraordinary setting that we found there, where all the houses are caged. Jane Goodall's own house is caged. The house where she brought up her own child is caged, and now today you can still see the children of the workers, of the staff who are based there, peering out through the mesh that covers the doors and windows of their homes. And I decided to use that. The reason is that chimpanzees have been known to take children. One child from Gombe Stream was taken and killed by chimpanzees. So, and this becomes a part of the story in Congo Dawn. So once again, as always, I found that there's a journey, there's my own story, there's my research and reading that all combine and emerge as a novel. Graham Greene's a writer whose work I really love, and years ago I read a book called A Burnt Out Case, set in the Congo towards the end of the colonial era. So this was another book that my thoughts went back to once I decided that Congo would be the setting of my new story. And leprosy, of course, was a topic that I'd always been interested in because of my childhood fear, basically, of leprosy and of going to leprosy missions where my father was working. So it was interesting to get the chance to really explore that, the disease, how it played out in people's lives. And there are interesting parallels actually in Congo Dawn around physical illness and moral illness, I suppose you could say, and about good and evil, and about damage to the body versus damage to the heart. Congo Dawn's a big book. It took a long time to write, and there was lots of research that meant that I had to keep going back to the research as I faced each new challenge in the writing of the story. But it was a very important book for me to write. It covered material that I really wanted to delve into, and I'm glad I've got to the end of it and that it's finished. I'm very proud of the work and the book, and the characters have lingered with me. Dan Miller is my first male character, first person that I've written from their point of view. I use very limited point of view. So that meant that I spent half of those couple of years inside the head and heart and soul of this male character who was a soldier, and that was quite, I think it changed me in a way as a writer to have gone on that journey with him. And so it'll be interesting to see what I write next, having gone on that long journey with him. It's a story I really wanted to tell, and I hope that my readers take it to their hearts in the way that they have with some of my other stories.